January 1911. Northern Karelia, Russian Empire. The morning Ivan Petrov cut the last of the spruce branches for his roof, the temperature stood at -34 degrees Celsius, and the sound of the forest carried farther than it should have. That was the first sign something was wrong. In deep cold, noise traveled clean and sharp, as if the air itself had turned to glass. Ivan paused, axe resting against his knee, and listened to the hollow echo of a woodpecker 3 ridges away. The wind had stopped. Not eased. Not shifted. Stopped completely. People in the village of Kaliasari would later say that was the moment the land held its breath. Ivan lived 3 kilometers beyond the last timber house, where the packed road dissolved into a narrow track and then into nothing at all. He was not a hermit by choice. He was a widower with no sons, no brothers, and no money left to rebuild after the fire took his cabin the previous spring. The fire had started in the stovepipe, a hairline crack he had not seen, and by the time he noticed smoke curling the wrong way, the roof beams were already burning. He had stood barefoot in the snow, watching the place where his wife had once baked bread collapse into ash. The village council had offered him a corner in the communal barn for the summer. Temporary thing, they said. By autumn, they assumed he would take a labor contract farther south or move in with distant cousins near the rail line. No one expected him to stay. But Ivan stayed. When he refused the timber plot the council assigned him, men laughed. When he turned down help hauling logs, they frowned. When he began carrying tools and supplies toward the limestone ridge instead of the forest, laughter turned to open concern. "You can't live in a hole," said Mikhail Orlov, the mill foreman, shaking his head. "Even bears know better." "The ground steals heat," said Sergei Volkov, who had lost 2 toes to frostbite in the winter of 1898. He lifted his boot to show the misshapen leather. "Koltsinks. You put yourself underground, you'll freeze from the bones out." Anna Kirova, who ran the village school and believed it her duty to worry aloud, was blunter. "A man alone in a cave through winter is a dead man. We'll be digging you out come February. If there's anything left to bury." Ivan listened. He always did. He nodded. He thanked them for their concern. Then he kept walking. The cave was not a secret. Hunters had used it for decades to store meat in summer and shelter during storms. It opened low and wide into the ridge, a shallow arch of gray limestone half buried by snow. In spring, meltwater trickled from a seam in the back wall and ran clear even in late autumn. The opening faced south-southwest. That mattered. Ivan had checked it with the sun, marking the arc on the stone with charcoal over several days. He had grown up in the White Sea region, where winters punished mistakes without mercy. His father had taught him fewer words than lessons, and one of those lessons was simple. The earth does not change its temperature just because the air above it does. Below a certain depth, the ground stays steady. Cold winters. Hot summers. The stone does not care. What Ivan was doing looked like madness to people who had never measured warmth. By late October, snow already crusted the ridge. Ivan had cleared the cave floor down to bare stone and cut a shallow trench from the back wall to the entrance. It sloped just enough to carry water away. He lined it with flat shards of limestone and packed clay between the seams. Moisture was the enemy. He treated it first. He built a wall not at the mouth of the cave, but 4 meters inside it. That too drew comment. "Why give up light?" Mikhail asked when he came out to look, breath fogging his beard. "Why not build at the entrance like a sensible man?" Ivan did not answer right away. He was fitting the last of the beams, tapping them into notches he had chiseled directly into the rock. No nails. No iron to split the wood in deep cold. "Air," he said finally. "I want to stop it before it moves." The wall was double-planked, filled with dried moss and clay tamped hard by hand. An air gap, sealed but accessible. A door thick enough to feel heavy even before the hinges were set. Behind it, the cave narrowed, the ceiling lowering gradually until it forced warm air to settle instead of escape. They called it a tomb. Children dared each other to touch the stone and run back laughing. Men shook their heads and went back to stacking firewood higher against their cabins. No one asked where Ivan would get fuel. They assumed he would learn the hard way. The winter announced itself early. By mid-November, the river locked solid, ice singing at night as it thickened. Smoke from chimneys rose straight and thin, then vanished into a pale sky. Ivan finished his stove on the 22nd, hauling it piece by piece from a trader in the next district. It was small. Too small, according to everyone who saw it. Barely wide enough for a kettle. He set it against the back wall of the cave, not the center. He sealed the flue carefully, running the pipe along the ceiling stone before angling it upward toward the entrance. The heat would linger longer that way. The smoke would draw without pulling warmth straight out. On the first night he slept inside, the temperature outside dropped to -27. Inside the cave, with no fire burning, it held just above freezing. Ivan lay on his narrow bed, listening to the sound of stone cooling slowly around him, and felt something close to relief. The mocking stopped when December came hard. Snow fell for 3 days without pause, heavy and wet at first, then lighter as the cold sharpened. Roofs groaned. Paths vanished. Men broke trail to the well each morning, boots sinking deeper than the day before. Wood piles shrank faster than planned. Ivan walked into the village every third day, face wind-burned but eyes clear. He bought flour, salt, lamp oil. He never lingered. He never complained. "You still alive in there?" Sergei asked once, half joking. "So far," Ivan said. By the second week of January, the sky turned a color people remembered from bad years. Flat, wet. The sun a pale coin behind it. The wind died again. Completely. On the night of January 12th, the temperature fell 12 degrees in 6 hours. By morning it was -38. That was when the dogs stopped barking. In Kaliasari, silence meant danger. The kind that settled in and stayed. The kind that did not pass with a change of wind. Ivan stood at the mouth of his cave, clearing snow from the entrance with slow, careful movements. Inside, the stone held yesterday's warmth. The stove had gone cold hours ago, and it did not matter. He could feel the difference in the air against his skin. Stable. He looked toward the village, a dark smudge beneath the ridge, chimneys already smoking harder than they should have at dawn. People were burning more wood than they planned. Ivan set his shovel aside and listened to the deep quiet of the land. He had felt this before. Once, as a boy, when the sea ice locked early and the cold deepened until even seasoned men stopped traveling. This was not a storm that passed. This was a test. And no one in Kaliasari believed the man in the cave would survive it. By the third day of the cold, the village began to smell different. It was not smoke alone. Smoke was normal in winter. This was sharper. Bitter. The smell of resin burning too fast, of damp wood forced into stoves that were never meant to work this hard. It clung to clothes and hair and settled low between the houses, trapped by the still air. Inside those houses, people were counting. They counted logs stacked against the wall. They counted sacks of grain. They counted hours between stoking the fire and waking to find frost creeping across the inside of the windows. They counted children. Ivan Petrov did not hear most of this. The ridge kept the village sounds distant, and the cave held its own quiet. But he felt the cold press harder against the stone. He felt the outside temperature dropping faster than the ground could release its stored warmth. He watched his breath inside the cave one morning and noted how long it lingered before fading. That was his way of measuring danger. He lit the stove only when he needed to cook. A small fire. Dry wood. No waste. The stone behind the stove drank in the heat, darkening slightly where the warmth spread. Ivan had learned to read that pattern. It told him how much he could afford to burn. In the village, there was no such calm. On the second night, the Kirov family's chimney cracked. It was a sound like a rifle shot, sharp and sudden, followed by smoke pouring back into the room. They shut the stove down at once, wrapping the children in blankets and praying the temperature would rise by morning. It did not. Mikhail Orlov stayed up all night feeding his stove, one log at a time, afraid to let the fire die even briefly. By dawn, his woodpile was half gone. Sergei Volkov made the mistake of stepping outside without mittens to clear his doorway. He was back inside in less than a minute, fingers white and numb, heart pounding from the way the cold clawed at his lungs. And through it all, there was Ivan. He came down on the fourth morning, just as he always did, boots dusted with frost, beard rimed white. He walked steadily, not rushing, not lingering. People noticed how little his shoulders hunched against the cold. "You should stay put now," Anna Kirova told him, pulling her shawl tighter as she unlocked the schoolhouse. "They say it's getting worse." Ivan nodded. "It is." She studied him, then asked the question she had been holding back for weeks. "Are you warm?" "Yes." Not bravado. Not defiance. Just a fact. By the evening of the fourth day, the temperature dropped below -40. That was when the first real fear set in. The Volkov stove began to smoke badly. The flue iced over where moisture met cold air, narrowing the draw until smoke had nowhere to go but back inside. Sergei tried to chip the ice free. The metal burned his hands through the gloves. He stopped when his fingers went numb. The Orlovs ran out of dry wood. The logs they had stacked in the shed were rimed with frost, damp from earlier snow. They burned anyway, hissing and popping, giving less heat with every armful. People began to gather in the largest houses, crowding together to conserve warmth. Bodies helped. Blankets helped. But air still leaked through walls never meant to be sealed this tight. That night, a child cried until exhaustion took her voice. Ivan sat alone in the cave, listening to the steady drip of the spring at the back wall. The water never slowed. It never froze. He poured some into a cup and held it, feeling the constant cool against his palm. The stone beneath his feet was not cold. It was steady. He fed the stove a single split log and watched the flame settle. He thought of his wife. She had hated the cold. Her hands ached in winter, joints stiff long before her time. When they had first moved north, she had asked him once if the land ever felt kind. "It can," he had said then, "if you listen." On the fifth morning, the wind returned. Not a howl. Not a storm. Just movement. Enough to drive the cold deeper, to push snow into gaps and seams, to strip heat from walls faster than stoves could replace it. By noon, 2 families had no fire at all. Mikhail Orlov went door to door, trying to organize something like a plan. Move people into fewer houses. Share fuel. Share food. He did the math in his head and did not like the answer. If this lasted another 2 days, people would start losing fingers. So worse. That was when someone said Ivan's name out loud. It was not a suggestion at first. More an admission. "He's still alive up there," Anna said quietly. "He comes down every few days. He looks better than any of us." There was a pause. "No," Sergei said. "That cave will be colder than this. Stone steals heat." Mikhail did not answer right away. He had noticed the same thing Anna had. Ivan's face. The color in it. The way he did not smell of smoke. "He's not burning wood like we are," Mikhail said finally. "He never buys much." They stood there, the truth pressing in like the cold. No one wanted to say it. Pride had a way of stiffening in winter. On the 6th day, old Pavel Morozov collapsed. He had been walking from the well when his legs simply stopped responding. 2 men dragged him inside, boots leaving shallow grooves in the packed snow. His hands were blue. His breath shallow and fast. They laid him near the stove, fed it everything they dared, and waited. Ivan did not come down that day. The track up the ridge had vanished under drifting snow. The longer, safer route was buried. The north path was impassable in the wind. Anyone going up there would be risking more than frostbite. By nightfall, the temperature fell again. -42. The village settled into a quiet that was not peace. It was endurance. The kind that costs something every hour. At dawn on the 7th day, the blizzard arrived. It came without warning. Snow driven flat by wind, visibility dropping to nothing. The kind of storm that erased paths in minutes and punished mistakes instantly. Inside his cave, Ivan felt the pressure change. He checked the flue. The airlock held. Snow slid harmlessly off the overhang, piling where he could shovel it away later. He sat on his bench, hands wrapped around a cup of hot water, and waited. In the village, people stopped pretending. "We can't last," Mikhail said, voice hoarse from smoke. "Not like this." No one argued. They all thought of the cave at the same time. No one wanted to believe it. But belief was becoming a luxury. And somewhere up on the ridge, inside stone that did not care how loud the wind screamed, Ivan Petrov remained warm. Not because he was stronger. Not because he had more. But because he had built his shelter to listen to the land instead of fighting it. Ivan began the real work when the ground was still soft enough to cut. That was the part no one in Kaliasari understood. They thought the cave itself was the shelter. They were wrong. The cave was only the beginning. What mattered was what he changed, and what he refused to change. He did not widen the entrance. He did not carve more stone than necessary. He did not try to make the cave into a house. He made the cave protect a smaller space inside it. That distinction mattered. The first thing he built was the false wall. He placed it exactly 4 meters from the mouth, where the ceiling dropped just enough to slow moving air. He measured it by walking the distance twice, heel to toe, then confirming with a rope. He wanted enough space to trap cold air before it reached the living area, but not so much that the volume became difficult to manage. Cold air moved like water. It sank. It pooled. If he could give it somewhere to sit without touching him, it would stay there. He framed the wall with spruce beams notched into the stone itself. No nails where metal could contract and loosen. The stone held the load. The wood only shaped it. Between the inner and outer planks, he packed dried moss, the kind he had collected all summer from shaded ground and hung to cure. He mixed it with clay until it formed a dense, fibrous mass that resisted airflow but still breathed. Too tight, and moisture would collect. Too loose, and heat would escape. The door was the heaviest thing he owned. He built it from layered boards glued with boiled hide and clamped for 3 days until the cold forced him to bring it inside to finish curing. When he set it on its hinges, he tested it with a candle. The flame barely flickered. That told him enough. Behind the wall, he marked the floor carefully. The living space would not be wide. Width wasted heat. He set his boundaries using the natural taper of the cave, allowing the stone to close in just enough to reflect warmth back toward the center. The ceiling at its lowest point forced him to duck slightly. He accepted that. Warmth stayed where the air slowed. He raised the floor 8 centimeters off the stone. That decision puzzled anyone who saw it later. Why lift yourself away from the earth if the earth was your heat source? The answer lay in moisture. Stone pulled cold from flowing water. Air trapped beneath a floor acted as a buffer. It slowed heat loss and kept damp from rotting the boards. He spaced the supports evenly, allowing air to circulate without drafts. The stove came next. It was smaller than anything used in the village. A shepherd's model designed for carts and temporary camps. People laughed outright when they saw it. "You'll be feeding that thing every 10 minutes, Sergei had said. Ivan smiled and said nothing. He placed the stove against the back wall, where the limestone was thickest. He left a narrow gap between metal and stone, just enough for air to move. When the stove heated, the stone absorbed it. When the fire died, the stone returned it slowly. He angled the flue not straight up, but along the ceiling first. Smoke traveled farther that way, transferring heat before it escaped. He sealed the pipe with clay and ash, testing it again with a candle. No backdraft. No leaks. The trench for water came last. He cut it shallow and wide, guiding any seepage toward the entrance where it could freeze harmlessly away from the living space. He lined it with stone and smoothed the joints with his hands until the flow ran clean. Water was not the enemy. Standing water was. Throughout it all, people came to watch. They stood at the cave mouth, stamping their feet, offering advice that came from habit rather than measurement. You should build higher walls. You need a bigger fire. That stone will sweat come spring. Ivan nodded. He listened. Then he went back to work. He did not argue because argument changed nothing. The proof would not come from words. By late November, he moved in. The first nights were quiet. Too quiet, some would have said. The cave muted sound until even the forest felt distant. Ivan learned the new noises quickly. The faint crack of stone contracting. The whisper of air moving slowly through the flue. The steady drip of the spring. He measured everything. He marked the inside wall with charcoal lines at dawn and dusk, noting temperature changes by touch. He counted how long the stone stayed warm after the fire went out. He weighed the wood he burned, recording it in a small notebook his wife had once used for recipes. On nights when the temperature outside dropped below -20, The cave held just above freezing without a fire. When he lit the stove for cooking, the air warmed enough that he could remove his coat. 2 hours after the fire died, the stone still radiated heat. That was the part no one else saw. In December, snow deepened. The path up the ridge became harder to follow. Ivan carved steps where the slope steepened and marked them with branches frozen into the snow. He cut extra wood and stored it inside the cave entrance, stacked where it would stay dry and accessible even if the door froze. He planned for isolation because isolation was inevitable. In the village, skepticism hardened into something closer to irritation. Ivan was breaking an unspoken rule. He was surviving differently, and that made people uncomfortable. "He thinks he's smarter than the rest of us," someone muttered in the general store. "He'll learn," another replied. "Winter always teaches." Ivan heard none of this. He was too busy refining. He adjusted the stove position by a few centimeters. He added a second layer of moss to the door seam. He smoothed the floorboards again where air moved too freely. Small changes. Quiet ones. When the temperature first fell below -30, he did nothing differently. That, too, was deliberate. Systems that required constant adjustment failed under pressure. He wanted something that worked without attention. The real test came not from cold alone, but from stillness. When the wind died in January, Ivan noticed it immediately. The cave air grew heavier, more stagnant. Smoke drew more slowly. He shortened the flue opening by hand, adjusting the draw until the flow stabilized. Too much ventilation would pull heat out. Too little would choke the fire. He sat with his back against the stone, feeling the warmth spread in a slow arc. He closed his eyes and listened. This was not comfort. It was balance. Up in the cave, Ivan worked quietly, measuring and correcting, while down in the village, people burned more wood than they planned and began to worry. They thought the danger would announce itself with noise. So, violence. They did not yet understand that the real threat was silence. And that the only person who had built for silence was the man they had dismissed as desperate. By the time the first true blizzard warnings arrived, Ivan's shelter was finished. Not impressive. Not large. But ready. And when the storm finally came, it would not be a test of strength. It would be a test of design. The blizzard did not arrive with drama. There was no sudden howl of wind, no wall of snow racing across the ridge. It began the way the worst things often do. Quietly. With a pressure change so subtle that only people who had lived long enough in hard places felt it in their bones. On the morning of January 19th, the sky over Kaliasari flattened into a dull white sheet. The sun rose without warmth, a pale blur that never fully separated from the cloud cover. Smoke from chimneys no longer lifted. It spread sideways and clung to the roofs like a low ceiling. By noon, the temperature dropped 9 degrees in 4 hours. By nightfall, it fell another 11. When the wind came, it came all at once. It struck just after midnight, driving snow so fine it slipped through seams in doors and window frames, hissing as it crossed frozen ground. Visibility vanished in minutes. The forest beyond the last house dissolved into a white void. The sound of it was not loud. It was constant. A dry, relentless scraping that never paused. Inside his cave, Ivan Petrov felt the change before he heard it. The stone under his feet tightened. The air pressure shifted. The flue drew faster, then steadied. He rose from his bench and checked the door seal with his hand. Cold pressed against it but did not pass through. He added a single log to the stove and watched the flame settle. Then he waited. In the village, waiting was not so simple. By dawn, snow stood knee-deep against the southern walls of the houses. Doors opened only with effort. Paths vanished almost as soon as they were cleared. Men worked in pairs to shovel, taking turns so neither stayed outside too long. The temperature reached -40 by mid-morning. That was when the first stove failed. It belonged to the Sokolov family, whose house stood closest to the river. The metal flue iced from the inside as smoke condensed and froze layer by layer. When it blocked completely, smoke poured back into the room, thick and choking. They killed the fire and wrapped their children in blankets, coughing and blinking back tears. They tried to relight an hour later. The stove would not draw. By afternoon, 2 more chimneys iced over. The wind grew stronger, forcing its way through gaps in walls that had survived decades of winters. Curtains moved though windows were shut tight. Frost formed on interior walls in feathery patterns that crept lower with every hour. People burned wood faster. Too fast. Ivan had measured his fuel before the storm began. He knew exactly how much he could burn each day without running short. In the village, no one had planned for this. They had planned for cold. Not for cold that did not move on. The second night brought exhaustion. Men woke every hour to feed stoves. Women slept in coats, boots pulled on but unlaced. Children cried in their sleep, then fell silent in that worrying way that made parents listen for breath. Snow piled higher. By the third day, drifts reached chest height in places. The well froze at the surface, the bucket rimmed with ice so thick it took minutes to chip free. The river was gone entirely, buried under a white mass that gave no hint of flow beneath it. Inside his cave, Ivan marked the day by the rhythm of the storm against the stone. He did not need a clock. The temperature inside shifted less than 2 degrees since the storm began. The stone released warmth slowly, evenly, just as he had calculated. He burned one small fire in the morning. Another at night. That was all. In the village, Pavel Morozov's breathing grew shallow. He had been lying near the stove for 2 days, feet wrapped and re-wrapped in cloth. When Anna Karova checked him on the morning of the 4th day, his toes were dark and stiff. She did not say the word frostbite. She did not need to. They tried to move him closer to the fire. The stove smoked badly, struggling against the frozen flue. The room smelled of damp wood and fear. That was when the realization spread fully, quietly, like cold through bone. They were losing. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But steadily. The storm did not ease. The wind did not shift. The temperature dropped again, settling at -43. Wood piles were nearly gone. Mikhail Orlov did the numbers one last time and found no comfort in them. Even if the storm broke tomorrow, even if the temperature rose, the damage was already done. People were weak. Houses were soaked with cold. Fires could not recover lost ground fast enough. Someone said Ivan's name again. This time, no one objected. Getting to him was another matter. The direct path up the ridge was gone, erased by drifting snow that reached past a man's waist. The longer route along the southern slope was exposed to wind that burned lungs within minutes. The northern path was buried completely. Only one man in Kalyasari had the skill to try. Yakov Belov had trapped these hills since before the village had a name. He owned a pair of wide snowshoes made from ash and rawhide and a sled light enough to pull alone. He listened to the wind, tested it with a gloved hand, and nodded once. "I'll go," he said. They tied a rope around his waist as a gesture more than a plan. In this cold, no one could pull another man back if he fell. Yakov took a small pack with hot stones wrapped in cloth and a flask of water that would freeze if he did not keep it inside his coat. He left before dawn. The climb that usually took less than an hour took him nearly 3. Snow swallowed his legs even with snowshoes. The wind stripped heat from his face until his cheeks burned, then went numb. He stopped often, turning his back to the gusts, counting breaths until his lungs stopped seizing. As he neared the ridge, something unexpected happened. The wind eased. Not everywhere. But here, where the stone overhang broke its force. Snow lay thinner near the cave mouth, sloughed away by gravity and shelter. Yakov saw the flue pipe first. A thin thread of smoke rose from it, steady and unhurried. He stopped, heart pounding, disbelief cutting through the cold. He approached carefully, expecting collapse, or silence, or worse. The cave entrance was clear. Not bare. But managed. A path had been shoveled and maintained. The door stood firm, rimmed with frost but not buried. The stone above it was darkened slightly by warmth. Yakov knocked. A moment passed. Then the door opened. Warm air spilled out, carrying the smell of wood smoke and boiled grain. Ivan Petrov stood there, beard frosted but eyes clear, coat unbuttoned. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Yakov could not answer at first. His body reacted before his mind did. He stepped inside, and his knees nearly buckled as the cold left him all at once. The cave was warm. Not barely tolerable. The stone walls were dry. The air was clean. The stove glowed softly, no roar, no waste. Ivan had a pot set to the side, steam rising gently. How long? Yakov managed. Ivan looked at him, then understood. Since the wind started, he said. I wondered when someone would come. Yakov laughed once, sharp and almost hysterical, then wiped his face with a trembling hand. The village is freezing, he said. We're running out of wood. One man's hurt. Children are cold. Ivan did not hesitate. How many can walk? He asked. That was the moment. The moment when the cave stopped being a curiosity and became the difference between endurance and survival. Ivan asked no further questions. He took Yakov's pack, hung it on a peg near the door, and moved at once to make space. The bench became a bed. The storage crates shifted closer to the back wall. Blankets were stacked within reach of the stove, not on it, not too close. Heat needed room to move. How many? Ivan asked again. 17, Yakov said. Maybe more if the children come. Ivan nodded once. He was already calculating. The cave held steady at just under 15 square meters of usable space. With bodies, the temperature would rise. That meant less wood, not more. Ventilation would need to be adjusted carefully. Too much air, and heat would escape. Too little, and smoke would linger. He opened the flue damper a fraction. No more. Bring the weakest first, Ivan said. The old man. The children. Yakov rested only long enough for feeling to return to his hands. Then he turned and went back into the storm. By the time he returned with the first group, the blizzard had worsened. They came slowly. 2 men half carrying Pavel Morozov, his feet wrapped in layers of cloth stiff with ice. Behind them, Anna Kirova with a child pressed against her chest, the girl's face pale and still. Another woman followed, lips blue, eyes unfocused. The moment they crossed the threshold, the change was visible. Breath slowed. Shoulders dropped. Hands unclenched. It took less than 10 minutes for color to return to cheeks. Less than 30 for the child to stir and begin to cry softly. Anna sat on the floor, rocking her, tears running freely now that she no longer had to pretend strength. Ivan worked quietly. He fed the stove 2 small splits of wood. No more. He moved the pot closer to the heat and ladled warm broth into cups, one at a time. He did not rush. Panic wasted energy. Calm conserved it. How warm is it? One man asked, voice rough with disbelief. Ivan did not answer immediately. He reached for the thermometer he had hung on a nail driven into a limestone seam. He read it once, then again. 12 degrees above freezing, he said. It will rise. It did. With every body that arrived, the cave warmed. Not sharply. Gradually. Predictably. The stone absorbed the excess and spread it evenly. There were no cold corners. No drafts. By nightfall, 14 people filled the space. They should have been cramped. They should have been miserable. Instead, they sat wrapped in blankets, backs against stone that felt faintly warm to the touch. Children slept. Adults spoke in low voices, afraid to break something fragile and miraculous. Outside, the temperature dropped to -45. Inside, the cave held steady. Mikhail Orlov arrived with the last group, eyes red from smoke and cold. He looked around once, slowly, then sank onto the bench beside the stove. We burned nearly 400 kilograms of wood in 3 days, he said quietly. You haven't burned a quarter of that. Ivan handed him a cup. The stone does most of the work. Mikhail pressed his hand to the wall. He kept it there for a long time. I told you it would steal heat, he said finally. Ivan nodded. It steals fast heat, he replied, and gives back slow heat. Slow heat is what keeps you alive. Pavel Morozov's feet were the real test. Ivan warmed water gradually, never hot enough to shock tissue. He cleaned the skin gently and applied compresses made from cloth and boiled herbs he kept stored in the cave. He elevated the feet slightly and watched the color change over hours, not minutes. By morning, the black had faded to deep purple. The village doctor, who arrived later that day, stared in silence. If he had stayed in his house another night, the doctor said at last, he would have lost them. Both. The storm broke on the 6th day. Not suddenly, but enough. The wind slowed. Snow settled. The temperature crept upward to -20. Dangerous still, but survivable. Paths could be cleared again. Houses could be aired. People left the cave reluctantly. They returned to homes that felt wrong now. Too large. Too drafty. Too loud. They carried something else with them besides their blankets. Proof. They spoke of measured warmth. Of stone that stayed dry. Of a fire that did not roar or consume. Of a man who had not argued or preached, but had simply built something that worked. Within a week, men were walking the ridge with Ivan. They asked questions. Real ones. About depth. About orientation. About airflow and moisture. Ivan answered carefully, never exaggerating, never promising miracles. Design decides, he said more than once. Not strength. By the end of winter, 3 families had begun cutting into hillsides on the south-facing slope beyond the river. Not caves. Sheltered homes. Borrowing warmth instead of fighting cold. The blizzard that nearly killed Kaliasari became the thing that changed it. Not because it was survived, but because it proved who had been right. When spring finally loosened its grip on the valley, the change was slow enough that people noticed it happening. Snow did not vanish overnight. It retreated in stages, collapsing inward on itself, exposing dark bands of earth along the southern slopes first. The river cracked and groaned before it ran free. Smoke rose lighter from chimneys, no longer forced downward by frozen air. But something else had changed, and it did not melt away. People in Kaliasari no longer spoke about winter the same way. They spoke about angles, about depth, about where a wall faced and what lay behind it. They spoke less about how much wood a man could cut, and more about how little he needed to burn. Ivan Petrov did not become a leader. He did not give speeches. He did not move back into the village or accept invitations to stay in larger houses. When people came to him, he showed them what he had done. When they asked questions, he answered them. When they argued, he waited. That, more than anything, earned their trust. By May, 7 families had begun work on earth-sheltered homes of their own. They chose south-facing hillsides where snow melted first. They dug shallow into the ground, no deeper than necessary. They used the earth as insulation, packing it tight against timber walls treated with pine tar and ash. Roofs were built low. Spaces were kept small. Airlocks became standard. Chimneys were angled, not vertical. Mikhail Orlov rebuilt his house with a bermed north wall and a ceiling lower by nearly half a meter. The following winter, his woodpile lasted twice as long. His children stopped coughing through the night. Anna Kirova convinced the village council to build the new school partially into the slope behind the church. It stayed warm with a single stove even on the coldest mornings. Attendance rose in winter for the first time anyone could remember. The doctor kept notes. Cases of frostbite dropped. Smoke-related lung problems eased. People spent less time huddled near fires and more time moving, working, living. They did not call it innovation. They called it sense. Ivan stayed in the cave for 3 more winters. He improved small things. A better door seal. A wider drainage channel. A slightly longer flue to spread heat more evenly. Each change was tested quietly, then kept or discarded. Nothing was done because it looked impressive. Only because it worked. In the winter of 1914, another storm came. Not as severe as the Great Blizzard, but enough to remind the village what it had learned. This time, there was no panic. Wood was used carefully. Houses held warmth longer. People checked on each other early instead of late. No one nearly died. Ivan moved into a small earth-sheltered home near the edge of the village the following spring. He built it himself, with help offered but rarely needed. The cave remained. Travelers used it as a way station. Hunters rested there. Once, a lost child was found warm and asleep inside after a sudden snow squall. The stone held. Years passed. Ivan grew older, slower. His hands stiffened in the cold. But he remained sharp. He corrected mistakes gently. He never said, "I told you so." He never needed to. When he died, quietly in his sleep during the summer of 1922, the village buried him on the ridge where he had first chosen to listen to the land. There was no monument, no grand marker, only stone. The cave still stands. The entrance faces south, just as it always did. The overhangs still shed snow. The spring still runs clear, unfrozen even in the hardest cold. If you place your hand against the back wall in winter, you can still feel the faint steadiness of stored warmth. The lesson Ivan Petrov left behind was not about caves. It was about humility. He understood that survival was not a contest against nature. It was a conversation with it. He measured instead of assuming. He observed instead of copying. He trusted principles older than habit and quieter than pride. When certainty failed, when tradition burned too much wood and still left people cold, wisdom endured. The storm proved that, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. And because one man chose to work with the land instead of fighting it, an entire village learned how to endure without fear. That is not just a story about winter. It is a reminder. The earth is not indifferent to us. It is patient. And when we learn to listen, it will carry us through things that brute force never could. This story is inspired by real historical techniques. Characters and events are fictionalized for storytelling purposes.